You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I am a scientist. I am a scientist. I am a scientist. We gotta live on science alone.
Welcome to Unbiased Science, where we bring scientific method to the madness. We're your hosts, Dr. Jessica Steyer
and Dr. Andrea Love.
And this week, we are joined by Professor Tim Caulfield, who is a Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy, a professor in the Faculty of Law and the School of Public Health, and Research Director of the Health Law Institute at the University of Alberta. His interdisciplinary research on topics like stem cells, genetics, research ethics, the public representations of science, and public health policy has allowed him to publish over 350 academic articles. He's a member of the Order Canada and a fellow of both the Royal Society of Canada and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. He contributes frequently to the popular press and is the author of 2 national bestsellers. And we'll link to all of this in the show notes. The Cure for Everything, Untangling the Twisted Messages About Health, Fitness and Happiness, and Is Gwyneth Paltrow Wrong About Everything? When Celebrity Culture and Science Clash. By the way, that might be the best title ever.
The answer is yes to that.
His most recent book is Relax, Damn It, A User's Guide to the Age of Anxiety. Caulfield is also the co-founder of the Science Engagement Initiative, #ScienceUpFirst, and was the host and co-producer of the award-winning documentary TV show, A User's Guide to Cheating Death, which has been shown in over 60 countries, including streaming on Netflix in North America. Well, our efforts are very much aligned with yours, although our backgrounds are obviously quite different. So you have a law degree, whereas I have a doctorate in public health, and Andrea has a PhD in biomedical sciences. So this will be a really fun mashup for today.
And I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us. We are super excited to get into all of these topics. It's something that's near and dear to our hearts, and certainly a point of frustration.
Well, it's an honor to be here. I love the work that you guys are doing. For sure, our universes are aligned. So yeah, looking forward to this conversation.
So maybe we should just dig in. And it's funny because, I know we're going to talk about some specific examples of the media's role in spreading misinformation, but I'm a little bit salty about some stuff that's happened recently in the US, and I think we can chat about it later. But let's talk about a topic that you've actually, have an article that came out recently, which is kind of this, the rejection of science or the concept of both sides when talking about a variety of science and health topics. So, Timothy, maybe you can kind of, set the stage and talk about some of the trends that we're seeing.
Yeah, this is the problem of false balance. And you guys, I actually think this is becoming one of the dominant issues in pop culture when it comes to skewing the representation of science. And I don't think it gets enough attention. It's sometimes called both sideism. You've probably heard that phrase. And it's absolutely everywhere. In the piece, I suggest that our current information ecosystem is really a massive false balance machine. And so what do I mean by this, and why is it so important? Well, we're increasingly seeing fringe ideas. Often these ideas do not have a good scientific foundation at all. Or maybe, let's be generous, they have, a sprinkling of scientific plausibility to them. But they're held up in pop culture as if they're equal to the scientific consensus. And we're seeing this again and again and again. And it does great harm. There's a fascinating study that came out of Europe very recently, where they asked the public, and it was a fairly large sample size, by the way, you guys. So I think it was a pretty robust, it's hard to study this stuff well, but it was a pretty robust methodology. They asked the public, what is the medical profession's view of the COVID vaccine, right? How much do they trust the COVID vaccine? And listen to this, you guys, 90% of the public think that the medical profession is split on the topic. Like 50% think it's okay and 50% think it's not okay. When the reality is over 90% of the medical profession think it's safe and effective. And by the way, only a very small percentage in this study thought it was problematic. And that is a great example of false balance, because that false balance has a direct impact on the public's perception. By the way, colleagues of mine at UBC did a similar study, and they found in Canada, and they surveyed experts on the COVID vaccine, 99% think it's safe and effective. 99%.
There was a recent study that came out of the US, and they were looking of physicians specifically that were spreading misinformation about the COVID vaccine. And it was actually traced back to just 50 physicians that were responsible for almost all of the vaccine-related misinformation. And there's some very prominent vocal ones on Twitter that I'm sure you can guess, but it's perceived by the public as being a much larger proportion than it is in reality.
And there have been good studies that have shown that this false balance does have an impact on public perceptions. It does have an impact on health behaviors like vaccination, obviously, but we've also seen it with things like GMOs. We've seen it with things like climate change. And the other thing I find, I'll put my legal hat on just for a moment, which a hat that I rarely wear, by the way. It also impacts this idea of censorship, of this idea that people are being silenced and we're infringing on people's freedom of expression. On the contrary, people are going on the world's most popular podcast and complaining about being silenced. They're going on the most popular cable news show and complaining about we should all be so silenced, right? So some of our own research has shown that these fringe ideas are, on the contrary, not being silenced, they're being overrepresented in pop culture. And by the way, most of the physicians, I'm sure you guys have seen this data, most of the physicians that allegedly have been silenced haven't been. There's been very little action from regulators to take, to stop MDs. And by the way, I think that regulators already have that obligation and that power to do that, because they're holding, professionals to a standard of care. We can have a conversation about that later. But the bottom line, false balance is doing a lot of harm. Both sides and I'll end before I'm going on for a while. There is good news. There have been a couple of other studies, again, quite recent, let's say the last couple of months, that have found that telling the world about the scientific consensus does change perspective. So there is good news here. So this is also a tool that we can use to fight misinformation, explaining what the scientific consensus is. And by the way, we also shouldn't fall for the idea that the scientific consensus is somehow, groupthink, or that you are, overly concerned. That's not the case at all. Scientists are always challenging the conventional perspectives. They're always challenging it, right? That's not what we're talking about here.
Well, it's so interesting that you say that, because I think we obviously echo that sentiment, but then we'll often hear, but no, like these few voices are being suppressed. They're trying to bring the truth to the surface, and we're suppressing them.
Galileo.
Exactly. And actually, we just had Dr. Peter Hotez on the pod. We're still totally just reeling from that. It was amazing. But we were talking about how RFK Jr. wanted to debate him, and obviously, that got a lot of traction with the Rogan Bros and all those audiences. And I think what his core reason for not doing it is related to this idea of false balance, that you're sort of implying by saying that, we'll debate about vaccines, that there's somehow equal weight to the arguments on both sides of this, So I just was curious how you felt about his decision not to debate.
I totally agree. Of course, I know Peter. He's a fantastic and a brave guy, right? I totally agree with this position. And, I've been subjected to the same. It's a stunt. It's a misinformation stunt, right, is what it is. Debate me. I've had the situation where I've got, offers to debate anti-vaxxers. And by the way, I don't really get a formal offer, right? It's always done on social media. It's
a challenge on Twitter.
Exactly.
Debate me, bro.
Right. Exactly right. And then when I don't, and they'll make posters up, right? And they'll say who's accepted the invitation and who hasn't. And then when you don't show up, they call you a coward. It's a stunt. And I totally agree with Peter. It's just a way to legitimize their view in order to create this veneer of legitimacy. And it's almost always a mistake. So I totally agree with his position.
So kind of to that end, what do you think is the biggest kind of fuel behind this idea of false balance? And it's not just with regards to vaccines and perception by healthcare providers. We of course see this in the wellness space quite extensively, where conventional medicine and science-based practices are essentially rejected for unproven supplements that are often promoted by completely unqualified people like your beloved Gwyneth Paltrow. What are the factors here? What's driving the appeal of false balance? Is it the media? Is it something more insidious than that? What's your take?
All the above. How's that for a lame response? But I think that there are some fascinating and evidence-based, right? We are starting to get more research on what's happening here, trends that are happening. And one, you guys know this, and I bet you talk about it all the time. I think I've seen posts on this from you guys. Anecdotes, testimonials, narratives, stories. There's a good body of evidence that tells us that relying on a testimonial or an anecdote can sort of shut down our ability to think scientifically. I mean, I always love to use the example of Nicki Minaj's tweet about the her friend's cousin's testicles.
Yes!
You guys remember that, right?
Who could forget?
That testicle ruined a week of my life, right? Because I was doing media. But it's a really good example of a whole bunch of factors that drive misinformation, right? So Nicki Minaj, I actually love her music. She has a big platform, right? And so she, and that matters, right? I think that's often, not said enough. They have a big, Aaron Rodgers, big platform, Tom Brady, big, you go on and on, right?
Do you know how many people I know don't eat nightshade vegetables because of something they said?
Well, Tom Brady's a great, the nightshade guy. I'm actually originally from Boston. I don't know if you knew that. So I bleed Patriot blue. So there's a Patriot helmet there. There's a doll of Tom Brady right there. Tom is a really good example of an anecdote, right? He is this incredible, if it works for Tom, of course it's going to work. I mean, how could you argue with success? But the Nicki Minaj tweet is, he has this massive platform. Nicki Minaj has this massive platform, and it plays to the illusory truth phenomenon, which I know you guys are familiar with. You're more likely to recall it, more likely to see it if it comes out of the mouth of a prominent individual. And there have been a lot of very interesting studies that have backed that up, right? So I think that's one of the factors. Then there is just the fact that they're telling these stories, right? There are these anecdotes. And so in the Tom Brady example, he's the anecdote, right? He's the testimonial. And the Nicki Minaj tweet about the testicle, she's telling a little story, a little scary story on Twitter that plays to all that research that tells us that anecdotes and testimonials can be very persuasive. And in addition to that, it's scary, right? So it plays to our negativity bias, right? And to this tendency for scary things to, again, land and be remembered and have an impact. All of those things, I think, combine. And if you think about, and I hate to always talk about COVID because I think this is relevant in a whole bunch of places, but we just have so much research on the COVID stuff too. Studies have shown that scary misinformation in the COVID context consistently got more traction, right? And but think about that you have all of these scary anecdotes, and many of them aren't even true, right? If you think about the died suddenly phenomenon, baloney, right? It's not even true, but that's one scary testimonial anecdote outweighs hundreds of millions of data points on safety and efficacy. And so I think that is a big part of the phenomenon. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why both sidism kind of wins, this false balance wins, because it'll be this scary, compelling story that feels like it deserves to be heard versus, the kind of boring scientific consensus, right, of a bunch of nerds who did rigorous research and came to a conclusion, right? So I think that's partly what's going on.
I want to bring it over to kind of the media's role in this, but I'm gonna not talk about COVID for a second and talk about another recent thing. So let's talk about aspartame and the example that we saw with regard to media headlines about aspartame. So for those of you who may not remember, there are two different entities, bodies within the WHO. There's the IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer. They are a working group within the World Health Organization that assesses hazard-based approaches to things that may or may not be linked in some capacity to cancer in humans. Separately, there's a different entity that's jointly headed by the WHO. It's called the JECFA, which is the Joint FAO-WHO Expert Committee on Food Additives. And they're the organization that's literally the expert on food ingredients, at the dose that we consume them, safety, and they're the ones that set the acceptable daily intake levels for different food additives. So within a day of each other, both of these groups, both under the umbrella of WHO, released reports with regard to aspartame, which is a non-nutritive sweetener that has been on the market for decades. And the IARC classified aspartame as possibly carcinogenic. Now, in the world of IARC, that means that there's no human evidence that aspartame causes cancer. It's the same category as several common antibiotics and pickled vegetables and other things. So that word possibly carcinogenic means that there maybe is some evidence mechanistically, there's maybe some animal model evidence, there's no actual human evidence. Separately, the JECFA came out, I think the report actually came out the same exact day, and they reaffirmed that aspartame is safe for consumption at the acceptable daily intake level that they previously set, and essentially reaffirmed that it is safe, and you'd have to consume, up to like 50 cans of diet soda a day in order to even hit that threshold, which is very conservative. And what the media did was publish a ton of articles saying aspartame being labeled as possible carcinogen by WHO. And of course, they didn't explain what the IARC verbiage meant, which was incredibly confusing. They didn't even mention the actual Food Additive Commission. And then, of course, this led to more fear mongering and more, oh yeah, gotcha, told you aspartame was toxic and killing all of us. So let's talk about this. What's happening here? Why aren't there more responsible reporting with regard to this? What's the end game?
And it is a great example of a lot of things that we've just talked about, right? And the other element here, and I don't know, I know I did a lot of media around these reports. I'm sure you guys did too. And the interesting thing is, if you come out in support of aspartame, and I don't even like aspartame. Confession, I went through a Diet Coke phase.
I'm obsessed with diet soda, but I don't care what sweetener's in it.
Yeah, but I've graduated from that. My wife still teases me about my Diet Coke phase. But if you supported aspartame, all of a sudden you were the baddie. Right, you were the pro-cancer person, right? So I think that is part of this, the narrative that unfolded, right? Is that you're been bought out by big food, by big pop, as we say here in Canada. You're the baddie, and the other thing is this, and you guys wrestle with this all the time, I'm sure. This perception of risk, right? We have to get to zero risk, and of course that is absurd, and it's very difficult to represent how small this risk, which is speculative too, I think it is important to recognize, and communicate it in a way that is digestible. I'll put it that way. And in addition to that, of course, a scary headline is going to win the day. So as you guys know, there have been a lot of really interesting studies that have shown that scary headlines outperform positive headlines. There's this fascinating study that came out, I'm going to say January this year, that actually mapped headlines over the past decades. And it's found that, scary headlines are increasing in frequency, ominous headlines, and headlines, I love this categorization with joy in them, are decreasing. How heartbreaking is that? Fewer, less
Doom
joy, more
scrolling
scary.
for the win.
Yeah, for the win. Exactly right. And that's exactly, I think, what is happening here. And so, I'm sure you guys saw this. There were stories that did a pretty good job reporting on this, but it wasn't in the headline and it wasn't in the first paragraph. And we know that that's what, studies have shown this, that's what people read, right? And, and I'm guilty of this sometimes. You read the headline, you read the first paragraph, you skim everything else, and the more accurate stuff is often near the bottom, or there's some quote from some boring scientist someplace, right? I think there's a lot going on there. And the other thing I'll say is, it's a good example of how science is hard. It's hard, right? And this aspartame debate has been going on for decades. There's been scary aspartame stuff for decades. So that's the other thing that they're leveraging. And it really highlights how, correlation isn't causation. And there's these bad nutrition correlation studies that are often come in the nutrition space, right? That get attention. Okay, the last thing I'll say about this is everyone, the pop culture, and I have studied pop culture for a long time, right? Pop culture loves stories about coffee, about alcohol, about chocolate. And by the way, coffee is almost a miracle substance. So hashtag team confirmation bias. But they love these stories, right? They love these stories, and they're going to continue to be rolled out. And we always have to look at them with a skeptical eye.
For me, it's what can scientists do if the media is not inclined to adjust this, and in many ways is really eroding scientific literacy and accelerating kind of the emergence of pseudoscience and chemophobia and the false balance.
It is an incredible challenge. I wish, and I bet you guys agree with this. I wish I had good news on this front because the problem is our information environment is becoming so chaotic and so frenetic, right? It's so fast paced that you can't really see pop culture, whether you're talking about the legacy media, right? We're not even talking about influencers and social media more broadly. You can't really see them dialing it back, There's been this fascinating research on pausing. I'm sure you guys have seen this, right? The idea, if you just pause even for a moment when you're digesting content on social media or on your phone, you're more likely to, or you're less likely to believe misinformation, less likely to share misinformation. And Gordon Pennycook at Cornell and David Rand at MIT, and there's others who have replicated this work, have found this to be the case. And they speculate, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but they speculate it's just this idea of of pausing. It's not necessarily even that they're applying critical thinking skills. It's just this idea of not being caught up in the frantic pace of our information environment. So because of that, it's going to become more difficult, I think.
And I think the News Literacy Project recently had a study about that too, that, the posts that people are more inclined to immediately reshare on social media are those that instill emotion and particularly fear and anxiety. And so it's this really challenging, phenomenon to overcome, because again, science is not, it's nuanced and it's not sexy and it's not all or nothing, and it's
We literally just did a post on this, Timothy, where we were saying how there's something sexy and appealing about these definitive black and white statements that are telling you this will kill you or taking this will save you, and we're saying, like, the truth of the matter, it's a lot more boring than that. It's, there is multifactorial, and yes, certain things might increase your risk in the context of other factors. But no one wants to hear that's a lot of words, right? So I think what we're trying to do is at least make people aware of that, but having that translate into a change in the way that we actually consume information, I think that's going to be a heavier lift.
What is interesting is it should invite scientists to collaborate with artists, with comedians, with graphic artists, and create these, because I like to believe there is a fascinating paradox, right? Because, do you fight fire with fire, right? And then are you just, okay, I'm just going to make the ecosystem even more chaotic and loud. I'm going to fight. And sometimes I do that. Sometimes, I'll be snarky to Aaron Rodgers or something, which is totally a Trojan horse strategy I'm using. I'm using the celebrity in order to get across the science informed. So, but in some ways, I'm fighting fire with fire. I'm playing their game, and their game. It sounds like a conspiracy theorist, but it is a paradox, right? And the other interesting, more seriously, a lot of the criticism that science communicators, regulators, public health officials are getting now for how they handled COVID is saying, "Hey, you were too dogmatic in early 2020." And we, and I'll put myself in this category, we were dogmatic because the science communication strategy has always been be clear, be definitive, and be actionable, right? So they tried to do that despite the fact that the science was uncertain, and it's backfired. Now, I think that backfire is often overplayed because I think what happened is the misinformation mongers have leveraged that and blew it up to make it more significant than it really was. They cherry picked quotes and things like that to make it sound worse than it really was. But nevertheless, that is the paradox we're facing as science communicators, right? To what degree do we get loud and definitive in order to combat misinformation? And I like to believe that we can, and I think you guys do this, we can be nuanced. We can reflect what the science actually says. We can reflect the uncertainty and the fact that science is a process, not a list of facts, and still make it engaging and still make it fun and still make it digestible. And I honestly think we can do that. Just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it.
Couldn't agree more. And it's interesting because we also sometimes, we test different ways of communicating. Sometimes we're a lot more serious or empathetic, or sometimes we're snarky, and and it's interesting how different people obviously respond differently to different posts. And some people will say how disappointed they are in us when we get snarky or we get a little sassy, and and it's, I don't know. I think we're trying out different tactics to see what is effective, and I don't think that there's a one size fits all, right?
You're right. And there are people that are, my friend Jen Gunter, who I'm sure you know, somehow Jen can be like all snark and it's just Jen, right? It's just how she is.
It works for some people.
It works for some. You got to find your voice, right? And then there are other science communicators that, Eric Topol, he's very straightforward, not a lot of spin, and that works incredibly well for him, right? So I think everyone has to find their voice, but I do think, we need to be out there. We need to be out there.
And you bring up a good point, Timothy, because there's a spectrum of science communicators, people with legitimate credentials, but we've seen that some have gone the route of disinformation and misinformation, and some of that's evolved over time. So there's a couple of examples, and maybe I won't name names on the podcast, but some very prominent.
I know where you're going, and I totally agree.
Some prominent people that were doing COVID communication early in the pandemic that have really gotten very fatalistic about the things they're saying, insinuating that people are, their immune systems are collapsing, which there are no data to suggest that. And then you've got, kind of separate of COVID, you've got like the Huberman bros who, are using their training in neuroscience to hawk supplements on very prominent podcasts. As a member of the general public, this is very confusing for them, right? How do they navigate this, and how, what's the guidance, or what would you recommend people look for when trying to suss out who's a credible science communicator and who's not?
Yeah, this is a really scary phenomenon, I think, because for all the reasons that you just said, I actually think that this tech bro longevity optimization trend, it's the new wellness woo, right? It is the new wellness woo.
And take all the, you're gonna wear your continuous blue glucose monitor and check your iron every hour, and take your hormones, and
don't forget your full body MRI. Gosh, you got to do that.
Yeah.
And a real quick debunk on that. I wonder if you guys agree with this. I swear to God, if you took 100,000 people, right, and had that 100,000 people exercise in a way that they enjoy, eat healthy, no magic there, sleep, Don't smoke. Surround yourself with people that you love. Pick the right parents and have the right socioeconomic background. You take those 100 people, 100,000 people, and then you take another 100,000 people and have them follow all the tech bro things. I bet the first 100,000 live longer.
Yep, I totally agree.
And by the way, they're happier. They're happier too.
Because people are paralyzed with this anxiety, and then it's this elitist, like, you got to buy all this nonsense and
diagnostic academic injury and overdiagnosis.
Keeping your immune system healthy it's not fancy. You just, like you just said, good hygiene, good sleep, good diet, diverse diet. You can have your ice cream, you can indulge, you don't need to panic. But it's being figureheaded by these people with terminal degrees.
Yeah, I call it science exploitation. And so what they do is they take a little bit of real science, right? So stem cells, microbiome. We have actually done a bunch of studies on microbiome hype recently. They take microbiome, genomics, personalization, precision. That's personalization and precision. That's one of the new health halos, right? And in fact, there was a fascinating study that came out again the last couple of months. It said if you just say something is personalized, it has a stronger placebo effect, right? And so they have that element to it. And then they they make it sound like it's definitive, right? So I don't want to name names either, but if you listen to some of these podcasts and you actually wrote down what they said, sometimes they're, accurate when they reflect what the mouse study says or what the tiny N, the N of 10 study says. But the vibe that is taken away from it, whether it's about cold water plunges or how you're supposed to sleep or what kind of water you're supposed to drink, is that it's definitive and we should all be doing it, right? And so it becomes very hard to critique because you're asking the audience to look at the studies and then compare those studies to the body of evidence. And so I have a cynical takeaway, cynical advice that I'm getting old and grumpy. Assume that whatever advice is being given, assume that it is no better than a healthy lifestyle. Just start with that assumption, and until there is a robust body of evidence to the contrary, just assume it's hypey science. And if you enjoy following it and whatever, but do not assume it's any kind of miracle. Just start with that until there is exceptional evidence to the contrary. Is that too cynical, you guys?
No. And honestly, I love it, and it drives me bananas because obviously I'm a microbiologist and immunologist, and the whole microbiome, hacking and all that. It drives me bananas. And like my most recent paper was investigating actual personalized drug therapeutics for cancer. And it's very different than all these personalized health hacks and take your supplements and take these unvalidated tests and all of that. And it's very frustrating because, as you said, they take this verb, this jargon that does have a meaning in somewhere in the ether of science, and they co-opt it. It's like using inflammation as the diagnosis du jour, and everything is linked to the microbiome. It's like you're co-opting legitimate things that exist, and you're now blaming everything on it and using junk science to sell things to people. And I think that's the thing that frustrates me the most, is that it's so predatory and it creates this fear and it's born out of this privilege, right? Same thing with people who fearmonger about GMOs and conventional produce. No, it's not, organic isn't healthier. There's nothing wrong with GMOs. In fact, we wouldn't have papayas if we didn't do GMOs because they were wiped out by a virus. And, but the people that can afford it are, affluent people. And then you see these people with lower socioeconomic status who are simply just not eating produce because they've been scared that the conventional stuff they can afford is bad for them.
That's right. And as you know, there's been a little bit of evidence to back up exactly what you said. The rhetoric around organics actually in the aggregate may lead to less consumptions of fruits and vegetables, which is a disastrous conclusion, right?
Yes.
The other thing the other thing that drives me nuts about the precision stuff, about the whole optimization stuff. We live in a world where most people don't get enough exercise. most people don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. There's massive inequity, and we're worried about precision. What the timing of our sleep. It's like completely.
It's absurd.
It is completely absurd and very elitist, as you point out. It's funny you should mention. We've done a lot of research in genomics. We're involved in a precision medicine transplantation project. Selecting organs via precision medicine. This is real. Yeah. This is real stuff.
Real stuff.
But
yeah,
niche.
but not right. But not for this.
And just think of the big science things that have been exploited. So genomics, stem cells, microbiome. Nano. I mean, you can go down. And then the other thing that they do, which drives me bananas, is they use all that language, right? The stuff I just said. And often one product will use all of those words, right? It's stem cell microbiome. And then it's natural, right? So they want to have it both ways. They want it both ways, right? It's super sciencey, but also not super sciencey. And by the way, it's been done for 2,000 years in this culture.
Right. And it's clean and chemical free.
Yeah.
Right. Non-toxic. So there are sort of two camps of people that we see. There's honestly, there's something with that also aligns with political affiliation. Like we see a lot of like the Gwyneth Paltrow types, like affluent white women who are extremely chemophobic, only organic, non-GMO, all natural, this and that. And then kind of on the other side of the aisle, you have people who are much more obsessed with, my liberties. No government organization is going to tell me to get a vaccine or do this. And I don't trust the FDA. And I guess, I'm going to biohack my own health and I know best. I'm sure you've observed this phenomenon as well. Do you see these groups as converging in some way? Is there some common ground that unites them in their kind of what's the word I'm looking like vulnerability to this misinformation or the pseudoscience-y stuff?
Yes, it's happening, and in fact, this is another topic I'm kind of obsessed with lately: is the degree to which health misinformation, which is the area where I do most of my research, health misinformation is increasingly about ideology. Who would have guessed, right? Right? So now supplements are, part of the right wing, and being anti-vax is part of the right wing. Who would have guessed? It used to be a new agey kind of, counterculture thing that you did, and now it's become, sort of an alt-right position. One of my favorite examples of the degree to which this is all about ideology, about in-group signaling, is the Marin County flip. Now, have you heard about this? So Marin County, am I pronouncing that right? As I want to make sure I am, because I know people say, it's an affluent county outside of San Francisco. Actually, Jen lives there. It's super democratic, super affluent, very educated, lots of professionals. And before the pandemic, it was amongst the least vaccinated places in the United States, right? New agey,
the granola heads,
yoga. I know that's what's happening in Marie. The pandemic happens, and being anti-vax is now a flag for the Republican Party, right? And you guys have seen the research. It's the strongest predictor of whether you're vaccinated or not is whether you're Republican or not, which is unbelievable in itself, right? So this becomes an ideological flag for the right. Marin County becomes one of the most vaccinated places in the United States. It demonstrates how this is all about ideology and personal branding and how you want the world to see you. And it's also incredibly depressing. And I can give you one more example, which a study, again, that came out just, I'm going to say 2 months ago. A very depressing study, but it really shows how ideology and polarization has taken over science. So this was a study that was done of the general public and physicians in the United States, okay? And they were looking at perspectives on COVID treatments, right? So think ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and other real treatments, okay? Ones that are effective. They found that the strongest predictor, so it's a correlation study, but still, the strongest predictor of whether your physician and the general public, whether your physician, their position on a COVID treatment was determined by what cable news show they watched. So think about that. You go to a doctor in the United States and your physician's position on a COVID treatment is most strongly predicted by what cable news show they watched and they studied this, and not the science they read. Oh, it's unbelievable and heartbreaking.
The implications of that are wild. I mean, it's literally life or death, depending on the way, the channels through which we're consuming our information. That's wild.
And the depressing thing is, I'm always an optimist, glass half full, despite what I said about being cynical.
I am a cynic through and through.
We know also from research, once something becomes part of your ideology, it does become more difficult to change your mind. In science communication world, we always talk about the movable middle, right? And I fear that movable middle is becoming more ideologically motivated on these topics. And I think that that's going to create challenges.
Yeah, it's been, and something Jess and I talk quite a bit about is, there's often a conflation about patient care providers, healthcare providers, physicians, and scientists and science. And I think it's really important for people, especially people who are going to see doctors, to understand, limitations, of their training and their expertise. And while we would love that they're always taking what the science is informing what their clinical treatment guidelines should be, it's unfortunately the case that, their personal biases often color what they're going to believe and ultimately what they're going to communicate to their patients.
One of the things I advocate for, and I know you guys do too, is this idea of scientific humility, right? That I think that is one of the sort of an ethos that we should really try to publicize more. And in a book that I'm working on now, you should always ask yourself, what are some of the things I've changed my mind on because of the evidence? How is my views evolved? And I have this list of things that I have. And if you don't have that list, you got a problem, right? You have a problem. And increasingly, unfortunately, I think that's becoming the norm. You can't change your mind because of the evidence, because it's my ideology. I've got this community that I live within. If I change my mind, am I still part of this community? Et cetera, et cetera. And so, it is scary.
And it's not flip-flopping.
Right.
That's the thing that I think people need to get past. It's not flip-flopping. If anything, it's a sign of maturity.
I learned something. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, what I'm taking away from this is that we have our work cut out for us. And sort of, honestly, social media and just media in general has really changed the way that we're all consuming information. And we have to get a little creative, I think, and sort of experiment with different tactics. But Timothy, I feel like we could honestly talk for a minimum of 10 more hours and just not run out of anything to talk about. Do you want to end? Is there an optimistic note that we could end on? Something that we could leave the people with that's not too depressing?
I do think I think that the good news, there are good news stories. We are getting more and more evidence, right? I've been researching this area for a long time, and we have all these great minds that are focusing on this. We're getting bigger studies on how to fight misinformation. It used to be we'd have these small little studies. Now we have these big studies that are really exploring how to fight this. I think everyone's taking this topic more seriously, whether you're talking about the UN, the World Health Organization, nation states, all over, they're taking this topic more seriously. And I think we're starting to get all these wonderful scientific voices like you guys out there, fighting the good fight, and so I think that, and by the way, for all those, scientists out there who are, should I get involved in science communication? Know that it is an incredible community. Am I right, you guys? It's a warm, fun, great
but
community.
It's exhausting.
It's exhausting. No more hate mail, please.
I know.
Oh, gosh.
Thank you so much, Timothy, for joining us. Truly an honor. Your insight is just, unmatched. I definitely want to chat with you more about some of this microbiome stuff too, because that's going to evolve as well. But thanks again for joining us. And thanks to our listeners. We hoped you learned a thing or two and, appreciate your science communicators. They're out here fighting the good fight while maybe the media is not always keeping your best interests in mind. So if you want to support our efforts experts and help us grow the impact and reach of unbiased science. We welcome your contributions. We have a donation page on our website, a Venmo account, and a coffee page. And we have some fun, snarky merch, like my Got Aspartame shirt here. You can pick up our snarky merch for season 4 on our website. It's www.unbiasedscipod.com. Of course, you can be sure to follow Professor Timothy Caulfield at Caulfield Tim on Instagram. Is it the same handle on Twitter?
On Twitter, on all the platforms, eh?
All the platforms. It's at Caulfield Tim. So make sure to follow him and make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channels. We are recording video this season and all of our social channels. Our handle is at Unbiased SciPod. Catch you next time on the pod, your trusted source for no nonsense, just science.
I am a scientist. Yeah, I am a scientist.